Welcome to the Profile Show. I'm your host, Linda Sandu. I'm here today with my good friend, Jeff Patterson. Jeff, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be back on the Cape.
We love having you on the Cape. I'm going to have you introduce yourself. You wear so many hats, and you're very involved with many amazing organizations. So I'm going to have you read off your resume.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm a professor emeritus in the Department of Family Medicine at the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and Public Health, where I continue a very active practice and teaching and research and practice. So that keeps me going.
That's right.
I've been involved with Physicians for Social Responsibility, an organization that's been around since the 60s, since the early 80s when I got involved with it. And I'm currently the president of National Physicians for Social Responsibility, an organization of about 30,000 members.
Oh, wow.
And we're a part of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, a worldwide organization. I'm also the medical director of the Hackett-Hemwall Foundation, a charitable foundation that does medical work in foreign countries.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful, wonderful. You're a very busy man, and I know that for a fact.
Keeps me out of trouble.
That's right, that's right. Today we're here to talk about the Physicians for Social Responsibility.
Yes.
The major issue that you and I have talked about and that you want to get into is the nuclear weapons and that sort of thing. I want you to take a step back and talk a little bit about the history and why you chose to get involved. 30,000 physicians in America involved. Why is that? Why did they choose that organization over another one? So if you can get into that a little bit.
PSR was founded in 1961 and 62 by Dr. Bernard Lown and a group of physicians in Boston. And Dr. Lown is a world-famous cardiologist who's still very active and interested in these issues. At that time, we published the first article on the effects of thermonuclear war in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1962, and the public really didn't know much about this at that time. It was that movement, that impetus, and also the collecting of children's baby teeth and finding strontium-90 in them from nuclear weapons testing around the world that led Kennedy and Khrushchev to sign the above-ground test ban treaty that put testing underground. We wish it would have stopped at that time. We'd been a lot better off, but it continued underground. And PSR continued as kind of a fledgling organization, and then Dr. Helen Caldicott came along in the late 70s, early 80s, rejuvenated the organization, and that's when I became involved. My first exposure, one of my residents asked me to go to a conference when we were going around the country giving lectures on the effects of a nuclear weapon going off in our cities. And it was honestly like I'd been hit in the side of the head with a 2x4. It was like, why didn't I know about this before? And this is an enormous threat out there. Why didn't I understand this and know about it? And I think that's the situation that most of the public and politicians even are in today, that there's little understanding of what goes on with this. So PSR since that time has been very active, thanks to Dr. Caldicott, thanks to Dr. Lown, who then went on to form the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, which is a worldwide organization of physicians working on the same issues.
Now, when you were hit in the head with this, how come more people aren't involved in it? You know, I know your organization is with physicians, but tell me a little bit about what the impact, what was the catalyst that made you say, wow?
Well, it was just realizing that this was a huge medical issue, and that if we have even a limited nuclear war, which we'll talk about, the effects are catastrophic. But if we have an all-out nuclear war, where we use even a third of the weapons that we have, it literally means the end of civilization as we know it, and perhaps the end of mankind on the planet. So to have this hanging over our heads, as Kennedy talked about when in his famous speech at the United Nations, he said, this is the sword of Damocles hanging over all of our heads, is a huge medical issue. And yet we're sort of asleep to it, and that's how I felt awakening to this. It was like, how can I look at my children and my grandchildren and think about generations to come and not do something about this? And that's how I've continued my involvement in PSR, which you don't have to be a physician to belong to. Everybody can belong to PSR. I really feel it is the right thing to do. And it is the thing that, as a physician, as Dr. Lown once said to me, I can do everything I want about cardiology, and I can give immunizations to kids and whatnot, but if we don't do something about this issue, none of that matters.
It doesn't matter,
Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah.
Now, you also, and it's not only nuclear war, as we learned from Japan, what, 2 years
Yes.
ago now, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's the power plants. It's an issue of radiation in general, and the release of radiation through accidents, large and small, Chernobyl, Fukushima, et cetera.
Right.
Accidental releases, small ones, large ones, and the continued exposure through those radiation pathways of the population coming up. We now know that Fukushima's been leaking radiation into the ocean, even though TEPCO denied it. And that includes the nuclear weapons industry, where we're having terrible time with the nuclear waste from the development of the bomb in Hanford, Washington. We don't know how to get it even out of the tanks to dispose of it. We don't know where to dispose of it. So this is literally a legacy that is going to poison our children, grandchildren, generations to come for the foreseeable future, that well beyond any tiny time frame that we have here in the nuclear age.
Right. Now, I know that this is new to a lot of people. Like a lot of people, when I recently told them about the show that we were doing, they're like, why are we worried about this? It's North Korea. We're worried about North Korea. Yes. You're saying that these small leaks, let's talk a little bit about, go into more specifics so people really understand it, like the Fukushima, the Washington bomb that's being built there. Talk about what that can do. Is it to drinking water? How is that affecting our health as we live on this earth?
Sure. So the issues are the effects of a nuclear war, which would be catastrophic, that we can talk about, but then the effects of the radiation that is the legacy of the nuclear industry since the time it started. And those leaks of radiation from the nuclear weapons industry, the nuclear power industry, and they really are one and the same, are going to continue for thousands of years because radiation doesn't go away. We know a lot about the effects of radiation on our health, and we know that radiation's not good for us. That's why when you go to the dentist, they put a lap shield on you and a thyroid shield to prevent you from getting radiation when they take necessary x-rays, and indeed in medicine we use a lot of x-ray that's necessary, but there's overuse of x-ray even in that setting. But these nuclides that are from the production of nuclear power plants and nuclear weapons get into the environment, and they get in the water, in the soil, they're taken up by the plants. For example, the trees around Chernobyl, 50% of the area around Chernobyl is forest, largely pine trees, and the cesium that's there is concentrated in the needles in the pine trees and in the pollen, so every spring it's released. If there's a forest fire there because of global warming, the trees are drying out, if there's a forest fire, that cesium is going to be re-released into the atmosphere and expose thousands of people again throughout Europe and throughout the world.
And what would the effects be? Let's talk a little bit about because people need real tangible.
So the major things that we look at and talk about are cancer effects. And we know that there is no safe dose of radiation from the Beer report, biological effects of ionizing radiation by the National Academy of Sciences. There is no dose of radiation which will not create cancer. So if we do a CAT scan, a common procedure in medicine, on 1,000 people, one of those people will develop cancer. And so we need to be very careful about how much radiation we as individuals get. Talk with our doctors carefully about, do I really need these x-rays? But we also need to be very careful about how much of these long-lived nuclides, like plutonium, which is 24,000 years half-life, cesium 30 years half-life, which you multiply that times 10 till it gets to a safe level. That's going to be in our environment forever. That strontium-90 that came from the nuclear testing, I probably have in my teeth and my bones still from the exposure that I got growing up in Iowa from that nuclear testing.
Wow.
It, in some people is going to cause a cancer. Is the cancer that I get caused by that, or chemicals, or just genetic things? We don't know. We have no way to tell. But there are other immediate effects of radiation, obviously, and this is from low dose as well as high dose radiation, and those include effects on our immune system. Cataracts is another one, that radiation causes cataracts, and it really is every organ in our body. The children in Fukushima were worried about thyroid cancer for them, but I heard stories in Fukushima from interviewing patients there who had left Fukushima with their children, that their children suffered nosebleeds, fatigue, just feeling awful, and we don't know much about those effects because we've been so focused on the cancer effects.
I see. So with those kids that were ill at the moment with the nosebleeds and stuff, are those continuing on, or who's monitoring this stuff?
Well,
or is this all part of what the your organization is working on?
Yeah, we are in some respects, but the Japanese government, through the medical schools there, is monitoring thyroids in these children. And there's evidence that children have increased thyroid cysts and nodules now. It's early for the thyroid cancers, although we're already seeing thyroid cancers in this population. And so we really don't know for sure what's going to happen to these children. And then measuring that long term means following them through their whole lives and following their children and grandchildren to see if genetic effects are passed on. And we know from animal studies, looking at animals which reproduce more frequently than we do, that indeed those genetic effects, changes in our genes, are passed on from generation to generation and tend to accumulate over time. In addition, these children and people in Japan are going to continue to be exposed to this radiation because the radiations in the trees and the plants and the rice, etc., that they're ingesting, and it's a continual exposure, not like getting an X-ray, which is a one-time exposure.
Right. But now to really understand it, how can the accidents already happen? Unfortunately,
Yes.
the accident already happened.
Yes.
We have nuclear power plants right here in Massachusetts.
Yes, you do. Yeah.
The accident's already happened over there. There's nothing that can safeguard them now. Is that,
There's a large area that they've moved everybody out of, and that's probably good.
And they can never go back there?
Probably they're not going to. It's like the area around Chernobyl, at least for the foreseeable future. 300 years, so it essentially is forever. Yeah.
Wow.
So there's that area. Then there are areas where they're trying to decontaminate. Decontamination means they scrape off the soil. I saw yards and schoolyards where soil's all been scraped off and piled in a corner. And so the problem with doing that is you don't...
The contamination stuff's in the corner.
It's still there, and it's going to rain and go into the groundwater and recycle through the trees, the pollen, etc. And so that is a continual thing. So decontamination is sort of a euphemism for let's make it as safe as possible, but we really don't know how to deal with this. And we don't know whether it's the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, whether it's Fukushima, Chernobyl, or other accidents that we could talk about. We really don't know how to deal with this. And no government, no company, nobody can deal with this adequately. And there are going to be people who are going to suffer and continue to suffer for generations to come because of this. So prevention is really the only cure here.
And prevention means?
Prevention means probably eliminating nuclear power. That's a more controversial issue, and we're really here to talk about nuclear weapons. It means preventing nuclear war. And the only sure way to prevent nuclear war is to abolish nuclear weapons. And that's what we're about when we're talking about the humanitarian effects of nuclear war. And we've really had that discussion multiple times. We had it in the early 60s when we published our first article. The freeze movement in the 70s was a huge worldwide movement to abolish nuclear weapons, and went nowhere.
Right.
And died
And we're
out.
50 years later from,
now
1962. We're
That's
50 years later.
years down the road, yeah.
So where have we come? Tell me where we've come from. Let's talk positive. Let's see what...
So the positive thing is that we had this huge buildup of nuclear weapons in the world when we were focused on the Cold War with the Reagan era, et cetera. We reached 50,000 or so nuclear weapons. It's interesting, we don't really know how many nuclear weapons are in the world because it's a secret. And the hallmarks of the nuclear industry are secrecy. We don't tell anybody what we're doing, and that's true of how many nuclear weapons are in the world. They are cover-up, which if we can't keep it a secret, then we lie about it, which is what cover-up means. And then if we can't do that, then we minimize it. Oh, this little radiation is no harm to human health.
Right.
No immediate harm to human health is now the current phrase. It used to be no harm to human health. So secrecy, cover-up, and minimization, the hallmarks, continue on, and certainly that's true in the nuclear weapons era today. So now we're coming back into bringing this into focus. What are the effects of nuclear war? Because thanks to Carl Sagan, who 20 years ago talked about nuclear winter, the effects of a nuclear war, and now other scientists have clarified this better in terms of if we have even a limited nuclear war, what will the effects be in terms of climate change? This is where these things interdigitate in addition to the radiation, and we now know a lot more about that. So we're again facing and trying to get the public to understand that this sword of Damocles still hangs over our head, perhaps even more threatening in some ways today because we're seeing the spread of nuclear weapons to other countries.
Sure. And so I still need to be very clear with myself as to what sort of changes can we make. You know, you say get rid of them. Is that really going to happen?
So President Obama has talked about that in two major speeches, and I think he's pretty clear in his mind that we need to do that. However, he couches this and says, "Not in my lifetime." Well, his lifetime is another 30 years, 40 years, okay. And indeed, that's what we're planning for, is continuing the development, modernization of nuclear weapons. We're planning on building new Trident submarines, a new brand of them, that will take us to 2080 in terms of continuing this fleet of submarines and the nuclear weapons that are on them. So that doesn't sound much like we really want to get rid of these nuclear weapons. And I think that's true of the G5, which is United States, Britain, France, China, and Russia. I don't think they want to get rid of nuclear weapons. We see this as the sine qua non of power in the world, how we project our power. And indeed, there are many in Congress now who are trying to slow down the START II treaty, which decreases the nuclear weapons. So you were talking about where we've come. So we've come from 50 to 60,000 nuclear weapons. Who knows how many there are exactly. Now down to about 19,000 nuclear weapons in the world. But that's still far, far more than we need to blow up the world many times over. And many of those weapons are still on hair trigger alert, meaning the president who carries around the suitcase, there's always a guy with him carrying around a 40-pound bag that he opens, and he looks at a card in there that says, if you want to launch 2 Slickums, submarine launched cruise, press this button. If you want to launch an all-out nuclear war, press these buttons, all right? And so he still has that. There's one in the White House. Biden has one. Obama has one. And there's some interesting stories about that suitcase. And President Putin has one too, and who knows else? Who else in the Soviet Union? So the problem with these weapons on hair trigger alert is there's a possibility that they can be used in that way. And we've come very close to that happening. The last time we know of was in 1995. And the Russians saw a missile coming out of Finland that was a weather satellite being launched, so the word hadn't gotten down. And they alerted the Kremlin and Yeltsin, who was a notorious drunk, about this. We don't know what happened there, but for some reason he decided not to launch the weapons in response. But you have 12 minutes to make that decision. So when we're looking at the catastrophic effects of this that we can talk about, no man should have that responsibility and that ability to destroy civilization in that way. And that's what we're now talking about as we see the spread of nuclear weapons to other countries, perhaps terrorists. We see the likelihood of accidents of intentional use in a war, you know, people, the fog of war that Kissinger talked about, the likelihood of their use, I think, increasing rather than decreasing.
And how are they getting access to these?
So
because it's not the homegrown terrorists can't just build their own.
Right, but you know, who knows what weapons are for sale on the black market?
Right, right.
And dirty bombs could be built by terrorists, meaning you take some radioactive material and you put it together with conventional explosives and blow it up in a major city. And imagine the panic and the pandemonium that would be caused by this.
We've experienced that here in Boston, and it was
tiny. That was tiny in comparison.
It closed down our world in Massachusetts.
Right.
It closed our world,
Right.
and that was literally homemade bombs, and we lucked out.
Yeah.
I mean, and people thought that. I mean, you know, people thought what was in that. That's what people wanted to know.
Yes.
Which, to me, is saying to you, that's why this is so important to talk about right now. Is because that really came up a lot. Is what were in those pressure cookers.
That's right. Yeah.
And
it could be some radioactive, because there's lots of radioactive material out there.
Right.
And imagine the panic that would be created. You know, people trying to get away from the city and traffic jams, etc. But you know, even that is fairly limited in scope.
Right.
And really, what we're talking about here is situations that are not limited in scope.
Right.
And so, if we look at the example of a limited nuclear war between, say, India and Pakistan. Now, India and Pakistan have almost gone to war numerous times. They've had conflict in the Kashmir region. They've had come very close to going to all-out war in 2000 and 2006, twice. And it was only a large international effort that kept them from doing that. So could that happen again? Of course it could.
Sure.
And India and Pakistan have, we don't know, 200 nuclear weapons between them, say 100 each. Just the explosion of half of those weapons between those two countries would release enough smoke into the upper atmosphere that it would surround the globe, and it would cause global cooling, the answer to global warming, I guess. But global cooling that would drop average world temperatures 1.5 degrees centigrade. And that smoke would go into the upper atmosphere because of the firestorms that are created by nuclear weapons going off on the ground. The smoke would circle the globe in 4 to 5 days, and we would have cooling in the whole northern and southern hemisphere, where we would have frosts possibly throughout the years, like when 1860 and when Mount Tambora exploded.
Right. And
they had frosts throughout the whole summer the next year that reduced agriculture, crop production. So we've done studies on this showing that indeed that's what would happen with this limited nuclear war between India and Pakistan. And so we would see the collapse of agriculture. About 1 billion people live right on the edge in terms of calorie intake a day.
Sure.
They would certainly starve to death because crop production in many of those countries rely on imports of wheat and corn and other crops. And then who knows what would happen in terms of the rest of us, in terms of, you know, food prices would go up astronomically. I think it would cause chaos in the rest of the world. Would humans survive it? Probably so. But it would be a very, very changed world. So that's just a tiny number of the nuclear weapons going off that are Hiroshima-sized weapons. That's the same amount. Then we look at an all-out or a broader nuclear war, and say 1/3 of the weapons that are available to the Russians and the U.S. in a conflagration that would occur. And that would put 50 teragrams of smoke into the upper atmosphere, and we would have literally freezing temperatures throughout the year in the northern hemisphere. And in that scenario, agriculture around the world would totally collapse.
Stop,
And we would certainly see the collapse of civilization.
That's stuff that's not out there. I mean, when you sent me all my literature, I mean, that was you gave calorie counts for the world, and that was a staggering fact that not a lot of people know about. I mean, you do. I think what you said is you think of the thyroid, you think of the obvious ones when there's nuclear talk, and but that's a whole big picture that's going to change our world forever.
Yes, it is, yeah. So this is the message that we're trying to get out to the public, in various ways now. PSR, the International Physicians, an organization called ICANN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, and now organizations like the Red Cross. And interesting enough, the Red Cross, since the dawning of the nuclear age, shortly after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the founder of the Red Cross, that nuclear weapons should be abolished, and now the Red Cross has passed a resolution again, confirming this and starting through its international organizations to work on the effort to educate people about this and to work toward the abolishment, the near-term abolishment of nuclear, not in President Obama's lifetime, the near-term abolishment of nuclear weapons. So we welcome organizations like that. We're giving talks to the Rotary, and the Rotary actually has a very active group against war, and I think probably will move into this area as well. But again, people need to be aware of this, and politicians need to be aware of this, and somehow educate ourselves, first of all, of the threat, and then that we need to move quickly to do away with these.
So in closing, we only have about 2 minutes left. I want you to be very specific as to what the public, the people who are watching, not only physicians, but the lay people as well, what can be done? What should we be doing? I almost feel like there's not enough being done, and but what does one do? I mean, so we contact our politicians.
Right. So I think the immediate thing, you can sign on to petitions. All three of the organizations I mentioned, PSR, IPPNW, ICANN, have petitions online that will be given worldwide to abolish nuclear weapons and to have a conference to start that process in the near future. We can support the non-aligned countries, countries who don't have nuclear weapons and are calling for this conference, and the G5 are very opposed to that movement, frankly. And it is important to talk to our politicians, our neighbors, to educate ourselves about this. This is not an issue that we can avoid. It's not something that, somebody else's deal here. This is all of our problems. So I think educating ourselves, going online to these organizations, signing the petition, becoming active and talking about it, I think are three things that people can do practically. Okay. Very good. Jeff, thank you. As always. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the opportunity. Yeah. Thank you. We love having you. I'm Linda Sandu. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.